Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the sun-drenched, blood-soaked sands of ancient Rome's most iconic spectacle. But not in the way you might imagine. We're going beyond the Hollywood glamour and the romanticized ideals to uncover the brutal reality of being a gladiator in the Roman Empire. Forget the noble warrior fighting for freedom. You're about to discover a life defined by desperate circumstances, relentless training, and an almost certain early violent death. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive your first month in training, let alone the arena. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing in the bustling, often chaotic, streets of Rome. Perhaps around 100 CE, you're not a noble citizen. You're a captive, a criminal, or perhaps a desperate volunteer. Your fate hovering precariously. The roar of the crowds from the Colosseum, even at a distance, is a constant, unsettling hum. You've heard whispers of the gladiators, these figures of both terror and fascination, but the path to becoming one is far more grim than any heroic tale. The overwhelming majority of gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Imagine the horror. One day you were fighting for your homeland. The next, you were dragged in chains, your freedom utterly stripped away. Or perhaps you committed a crime, and instead of a swift execution, you are condemned to the arena, forced to entertain the masses with your life. This was not a choice. It was a brutal, forced conversion from one form of misery to another. It truly sucked to have your life bought and sold like cattle. For the condemned criminal, or Nazi, the situation was even grimmer. These individuals were often sent to the arena to die in staged executions, sometimes dressed as mythical figures or criminals of legend. Ensuring their demise was both spectacular and humiliating. They weren't given the training or chance of survival afforded to true gladiators. They were merely fodder for the crowd's bloodlust. However, a small, often overlooked, segment of gladiators were volunteers, known as octorati. These were free men who, driven by desperate poverty, immense debt, or a thirst for fame, however fleeting and dangerous, willingly sold themselves into gladiatorial service for a fixed period. They would sign a contract, an octoramentum, swearing an oath to endure, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Imagine being so desperate, so utterly without options, that you would swear such a chilling oath. This highlights the brutal economic realities of the Roman Empire, where freedom sometimes meant choosing your own form of servitude, regardless of how you arrived. Your first destination would be the ludus, a gladiatorial training school. These were not glamorous academies. They were essentially prisons, designed to break your spirit and transform you into a killing machine. Imagine massive, high walls, reinforced gates, and constant armed guards. Your life, from this moment on, was dictated by the Hellenista, the owner and manager of the ludus, who had invested heavily in you and expected a return. He held absolute power over your life and death. Within the ludus, discipline was absolute and brutal. You would be subjected to harsh physical punishments for any infraction in insubordination, laziness, or even minor mistakes during training. Beatings, confinement, or reduced rations were common. Your body, already likely weakened by captivity or poverty, would now be pushed to its absolute limits, constantly aching, constantly tired. This wasn't about building strength through positive reinforcement. It was about instilling obedience through fear and pain. It really sucked to be constantly afraid of your own trainers. One common misconception is that all gladiators were muscular, perfectly fit specimens from the start. Many were not. They came from diverse backgrounds, often malnourished or injured. The ludus was where they were systematically broken down and then rebuilt, not necessarily into aesthetic ideals, but into functional fighting machines, using specific, brutal training regimens. Historians still debate the precise training methods and the psychological impact of the transition from civilian or soldier to gladiator, as direct accounts from the gladiators themselves are non-existent. So, your initiation into the life of a gladiator was a horrifying journey, stripping you of your freedom, your dignity, and your very identity. You were transformed from a person into a commodity, destined for a life of brutal training and a near certain violent end, all for the entertainment of a bloodthirsty Roman crowd. This desperate, unwilling transformation was the first, and perhaps most profound, of the horrors you were about to endure. Having been forcibly ushered into the grim reality of the ludus, you, the newly designated gladiator in training, are now plunged into a world of relentless, brutal discipline. This isn't just a military boot camp. It's a specialized, agonizing process designed to turn you into a controlled killing machine for public spectacle. This unceasing, often painful, training regimen was a defining, brutal experience of your life as a gladiator. Imagine your first days in the ludus. The sounds would be deafening, the clang of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion, the sharp crack of the rudis, a wooden sword used for training, but also for punishment hitting flesh, and the constant shouts of your instructors, the doctors or magistri. These men, often former gladiators themselves, were ruthless and unyielding. Their goal wasn't your comfort, it was your survival in the arena, which, paradoxically, meant pushing you to your physical and mental breaking point in training. It truly sucked to have your body constantly broken down. Your day would begin before dawn, a relentless cycle of physical conditioning. You'd spend hours performing calisthenics bodyweight exercises, running, jumping, and lifting heavy weights, rudimentary versions of dumbbells or sandbags. This was designed to build strength and endurance, pushing your body to its limits. Every muscle would ache, every joint would protest, but there was no reprieve. Failure to keep up would result in swift, painful punishment. Then came the weapon training. You wouldn't immediately be handed a sharp sword. Instead, you'd start with heavy wooden training weapons, often twice the weight of actual gladiatorial armaments. This was to build strength and stamina, making the real weapons feel light in comparison. You'd practice endlessly against a palace, a wooden post fixed in the ground, repeatedly striking and thrusting, honing your technique until your movements were fluid and automatic. Imagine swinging a heavy wooden sword for hours, your shoulders burning, your hands blistering, your entire body screaming for rest. The training was highly specialized, tailored to the gladiatorial type you were destined to become. If you were to be a mormio, you'd train with a heavy oblong shield, scutum, and a short sword gladius. If a thraex, you'd learn to handle a small round shield, parmula, and a curved dagger sacca. A retiarius would spend hours perfecting the throw of a net and the thrust of a trident. Each style had its own unique, demanding physical requirements and combat techniques. This wasn't generalized fighting. It was a highly specialized, deadly dance. One particularly brutal aspect was the use of mock combat against other trainees. This wasn't gentle sparring. While using blunted weapons, the training was intense and injuries were common. You would learn to take a blow, to fall, and to fight through pain. The doctores would oversee these sessions with an eagle eye, quick to correct mistakes with the rudies or a verbal dressing down that stung worse than any physical strike. The psychological pressure to perform, to not show weakness, was immense. The doctors were themselves formidable. They were usually former gladiators who had survived the arena, bearing scars that served as constant reminders of the brutal reality you were training for. They instilled a unique blend of fear and grudging respect, for they alone understood what awaited you. Their methods were often cruel but effective, designed to strip away your former identity and forge you into a hardened fighter. It really sucked to have your teachers be your tormentors. One common misconception is that gladiator training was purely about killing, while combat was the end goal. Much of the training focused on discipline, showmanship, and defensive techniques. A gladiator who died too quickly was bad entertainment and a poor return on investment for the lanista. So, survival, even through defensive maneuvers, and the ability to put on a good show were highly emphasized. Historians still debate the precise balance between offensive and defensive training, often relying on analysis of gladiatorial combat manuals and archaeological evidence from ludus sites. Furthermore, the environment of the ludus itself contributed to the brutality. You lived in crowded, unhygienic cells, often sharing space with other condemned men. The air would be thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. Disease could spread rapidly. Your diet, though designed to be high calorie as we'll discuss, was monotonous. Your entire existence was confined within those high walls, separated from the outside world, a constant reminder of your lost freedom. So, your time in the gladiatorial training school was a relentless, agonizing ordeal, pushing your body and mind to their absolute limits. Every day was a cycle of pain, exhaustion, and fear, designed to strip away your humanity and mold you into a brutal, efficient killing machine. This unceasing, physical and psychological torment was a defining, brutal experience, preparing you not just for combat, but for a life utterly devoid of comfort or peace. Even as you endured the ceaseless, brutal training in the ludus, your diet as a gladiator was far from the steak and protein shake regimen you might imagine for elite fighters. In fact, it was surprisingly peculiar, almost entirely vegetarian, and designed not for lean muscle mass, but for specific tactical and medical purposes, making it an undeniably brutal and often unpleasant reality. Imagine sitting down for your meal after a grueling day of training. You're not looking at roasted meats or rich stews. Instead, your plate, or rather, your wooden bowl, is filled with what was known as gladiator barley horderia. This was a thick, often bland, mush made primarily from barley, boiled with beans or other legumes. It was the absolute staple of your diet, consumed day in and day out. This wasn't about culinary delight, it was about sheer caloric intake to fuel your intense physical exertion. It truly sucked to eat the same bland mush every single day. The reason for this almost entirely vegetarian diet might surprise you. While Romans certainly ate meat, and gladiators were valuable assets, their diet was designed for specific physiological outcomes. The high carbohydrate. Plant-based diet helped gladiators develop a significant layer of subcutaneous fat. This wasn't about making them fat in an unhealthy sense, but rather providing a protective layer. Imagine this fat acting as a kind of natural internal padding when a sword or trident struck. This layer of fat would absorb some of the impact, potentially preventing the weapon from immediately reaching vital organs, or at least making the wound less immediately fatal. It was a brutal strategy to build a layer of blubber to take the hit. This layer of fat also helped to create more superficial, but visually dramatic. Wounds, a sword slicing through skin, and fat looks far more spectacular and produces more blood than a blade that hits muscle and bone immediately. For the Roman crowd, the sight of a gladiator bleeding profusely but continuing to fight was the ultimate entertainment. So your diet was literally designed to make your injuries more theatrical, ensuring maximum audience enjoyment, even if it meant a deeper cut that would hurt more later. Beyond barley and legumes, your diet might be supplemented with some dried fruits, like figs or nuts. For additional energy, vegetables, such as cabbage or onions, would be boiled into your pottage. Meat, as mentioned, was rare, usually reserved for victorious feasts or specific, infrequent occasions. This meant a constant deficiency in certain proteins and vitamins, leading to a reliance on unusual supplements. One of these peculiar supplements was a concoction known as bone ash, or calcium drink. Archaeological evidence from gladiatorial cemeteries has revealed that gladiators had remarkably high bone density. This is attributed to a drink made from plant ashes, rich in calcium, that they would consume. Imagine drinking a bitter, gritty liquid made from burned wood or bone fragments, specifically designed to strengthen your bones to withstand impacts. It wasn't appetizing, but it was essential for increasing your skeletal resilience in the face of constant trauma. It really sucked to drink burnt trees for stronger bones. This diet, while providing ample calories, was far from balanced by modern nutritional standards. The limited protein intake could lead to slower muscle repair and overall physical weakness over time. Despite the intense training, the reliance on simple carbohydrates could lead to digestive issues, and the lack of variety would cause immense palate fatigue, turning every meal into a monotonous endurance test. One common misconception is that gladiators were all perfectly muscular, lean athletes. While they were incredibly strong and conditioned, their physique was often different from modern bodybuilders or athletes. The focus was on power, endurance, and the strategic fat layer, not on ripped abs. Their bodies were designed for survival in a very specific, brutal context, not for aesthetic perfection. Historians still meticulously analyze the skeletal remains of gladiators, particularly the remains found in the Gladiator Cemetery in Ephesus, to reconstruct their diet, health, and causes of death, providing invaluable insights into their unique physiology. Furthermore, the strict control over your diet within the ludus meant you had no personal choice in what you ate. Every meal was prescribed, every portion measured. This lack of autonomy over even the most basic aspects of your life contributed to the pervasive misery of your existence. You ate what you were given, whether you liked it or not, because it was fuel for the spectacle. So, your daily diet as a gladiator was a far cry from a modern athlete's meal plan. It was a peculiar, almost entirely vegetarian regimen, heavy on barley and supplemented by gritty calcium drinks. This was a brutal reality, designed not for your pleasure or holistic well-being, but to turn your body into a resilient, dramatic spectacle for the Roman masses, ensuring that even your food was a constant reminder of your predetermined, violent purpose. With your body fueled by its peculiar high-carb diet, your life as a gladiator was defined by the arena and specifically by the deadly ballet of combat styles and weaponry. This wasn't a free-for-all brawl. It was a highly formalized, ritualized form of combat where every move, every piece of armor, and every weapon was dictated by tradition and designed for maximum spectacle. This structured lethality made your daily existence a brutal and inescapable dance with death. Imagine preparing for a fight. You wouldn't just grab any weapon. Your identity as a gladiator was tied to a specific class or type. each with its own distinctive armor and armaments. This wasn't about personal preference, it was about creating balanced, contrasting matchups for the crowd's enjoyment. Perhaps you were a murmillo, one of the most heavily armed gladiators. You'd be given a large, rectangular shield scutum that covered most of your body, a short gladius sword, and heavy armor including a crested helmet, often with a fish-like visor, making you somewhat resemble a fish. Ironically, for a land-based fighter and greaves on one leg, your opponent might be a thrax, equipped with a small, round shield parmula, greaves on both legs, a distinctive griffin-crested helmet, and a curved, slashing dagger called a psycha. The contrast in their equipment made for a visually engaging and tactically challenging fight. It truly sucked to be an armored fish fighting a birdman. Or maybe you were a retiarius, one of the most lightly armored and perhaps most terrifying. Gladiators. You would fight with almost no armor, just a shoulder guard gallerus on your left arm and shoulder, and perhaps a loincloth. Your weapons would be a net reta and a trident focina. Your opponent might be a heavy-armed secutor, the chaser, specifically designed to counter you, with a smooth, round helmet to prevent your net from catching, and a gladius. This was a brutal dance between agility and brute force, a terrifying chase across the sand. Each gladiatorial type had specific tactics and training. As a murmillo, you'd be taught to use your large shield defensively, forming a protective wall, then lunging with your gladius. As a thrax, you'd rely on the agility of your small shield and the vicious slashing power of your curved sika. As a retiarius, you'd need lightning-fast reflexes to cast your net, trap your opponent, and then deliver quick thrusts with your trident before they could close the distance. Your life depended on mastering these highly specialized, deadly maneuvers. The combat itself was ritualized. It wasn't just two men flailing at each other. There were rules. Referees, summa rudis or secunda rudes, and specific protocols. Referees would intervene to separate fighters, check wounds, or signal a pause. The fights were choreographed to some extent, designed to showcase skill, endurance, and dramatic flair, not just mindless slaughter. This made the fights fascinating to the crowd, but no less deadly for you. Even the duration of the fights was controlled. Some could be short and decisive, others prolonged duels of attrition. If both gladiators fought bravely and well, the crowd might call for a missio, granting both combatants a reprieve, but if one fought poorly or was clearly defeated, the crowd, or the editor, the sponsor of the games, would decide their fate with the thumbs up, usually for mercy, or thumbs down for death. Your life literally hung on the whims of a roaring mob and a powerful patron. It really sucked to have your life determined by a finger. One common misconception is that gladiator fights were always to the death, while many were, particularly in earlier periods or for Noxii condemned criminals. Trained gladiators were valuable assets. A lanista would be reluctant to lose a highly trained, expensive fighter. So while death was always a real possibility, many fights ended with one gladiator surrendering, hoping for a missio. However, the threat of death and the brutal wounds incurred even in non-fatal fights was always present. Historians still meticulously analyze gladiatorial casualty rates based on archaeological evidence like cemeteries and textual accounts. Finding significant variations depending on the period and context. Furthermore, the very design of your equipment, while often protective, could also be a source of discomfort and vulnerability. Heavy helmets, limited vision, and hearing, making you more susceptible to surprise attacks. Cumbersome armor, restricted movement, leading to exhaustion. Every piece of your gear was a compromise between protection and mobility, and a constant reminder that you were a tool in a deadly performance, not a free warrior. So, your daily reality as a gladiator was a brutal dance with death. Dictated by the rigid rules of combat styles and weaponry, every movement, every piece of armor, every thrust of your sword was part of a deadly performance designed for the crowd. This formalized lethality, coupled with the constant threat of a capricious crowd and the very real chance of a gruesome end, made your existence profoundly brutal, even as you mastered the intricacies of your gladiatorial style and perfected your deadly dance. Your life in the arena was ultimately defined by a brutal, inescapable truth, the constant threat of grievous injury and a gruesome death. This wasn't a game. It was a spectacle of violence where your body was merely a tool for entertainment, making every single fight a brutal and terrifying gamble. Imagine the deafening roar of the crowd as you step into the arena, the blinding sunlight reflecting off the sand. Your heart pounds, not just with anticipation, but with raw fear. You know, deep in your gut, what awaits you? It's not just a contest of skill, it's a brutal collision of steel, flesh, and bone. Every thrust, every block, every parry is a desperate struggle to inflict damage while avoiding a potentially fatal blow. It truly sucked to be on a live stream for your own death. Wounds were common and often horrific. Swords would cleave flesh, tridents would pierce, and daggers would find their mark, while your training and the specific armor might offer some protection. They were rarely impenetrable. A gladius could cut deep into your thigh, severing muscle and artery. A sika could hook behind your shield, tearing through your ribs. A thrust from a trident could leave a gaping, bleeding hole. These weren't clean, surgical cuts. They were ragged, tearing wounds, instantly filling the air with the metallic tang of blood. The sight of blood was paramount for the Roman crowd. They craved it, cheered for it. And the more spectacular the flow, the better the entertainment. You were literally expected to bleed for their pleasure. Imagine your vision blurring from sweat and blood, the agonizing sting of a deep cut, yet knowing you had to keep fighting, had to keep putting on a show, even as your life ebbed away. And then there was death. For every fight, death was a very real, very likely outcome. If you were wounded too grievously or simply outmatched, you would fall. Your opponent might press his advantage or wait for the crowd signal. If the crowd gave the thumbs down, the exact gesture is still debated by historians, but the meaning was clear. Your fate was sealed. The final, brutal act would be performed by your opponent or a specialized executioner, often with a sword thrust to the throat or heart, ensuring a swift end to the spectacle. Even if you were granted missio mercy and allowed to live, the injuries you sustained would be severe. A non-fatal wound could still leave you with permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, or lifelong disability. A broken limb might heal improperly, leaving you with a limp. A deep scar could limit your mobility. The psychological trauma of facing death repeatedly, of witnessing your comrades fall, would also leave indelible marks on your psyche, leading to nightmares, anxiety, and a profound sense of despair. The arena wasn't just a place of combat, it was a place of extreme heat and exhaustion. Fighting under the blazing Roman sun, encumbered by armor, would quickly drain your stamina. Dehydration, heat stroke, and sheer physical collapse were constant threats, making you even more vulnerable to your opponent's attacks. You were literally fighting for your life under conditions designed to break you down, both physically and mentally. It really sucked to fight to the death while also battling heat stroke, One common misconception is that gladiators were highly revered and always fought honorably. While some achieved fame, their status was always ambiguous. They were slaves, property, forced to fight for the amusement of others. Their honor was largely dictated by how well they entertained, not by their moral character. The crowd's cheers were fleeting, and their ultimate fate remained in the hands of their owners and the whims of the mob. Historians still meticulously study gladiatorial cemeteries, like the one at Ephesus, to understand the patterns of wounds and the grim reality of their short, violent lives, confirming the high mortality rates even among the most skilled. Furthermore, the very nature of gladiatorial games meant you might not just face other gladiators. Sometimes venationes, animal hunts, or damnati ad bestias, condemned to beasts, would precede or follow your fights, meaning you might be exposed to the sights and sounds of horrific animal slaughter or the execution of criminals by wild beasts. This constant exposure to extreme violence, even when not directly participating, would desensitize you and reinforce the brutal reality of the world you inhabited. So, your life as a gladiator was a constant, terrifying dance with injury and death. Every time you stepped into the arena, you knew it could be your last. The brutal wounds, the demand for blood, and the omnipresent threat of a gruesome demise made every single moment a visceral, brutal experience, stripping away any illusion of glory and leaving only the stark reality of your existence as a human spectacle. Even as you face the constant threat of grievous injury and gruesome death in the arena, your body, battered and broken, still had to be patched up, often just enough to fight again. This leads us to the brutal reality of ancient Roman medicine for gladiators, where the treatments were almost as terrifying as the wounds themselves, designed for functionality rather than comfort or true healing. Imagine lying on a hard cot in the ludus infirmary after a fight. The pain is searing, a deep gash perhaps running across your thigh, or a bone screaming from a heavy blow. There are no sterile operating rooms, no anesthetics beyond perhaps some wine or opium, and certainly no understanding of germ theory. Your doctors are likely medical specialists attached to the gladiatorial school, often slaves or freedmen themselves, with practical experience but limited scientific knowledge. They are there to get you back in fighting shape, not to ensure your long-term health. It truly sucked to have your healing be so horrific. Your wounds would be attended to with crude methods. Deep cuts would be stitched with needles and coarse thread without proper disinfection. Imagine the agonizing sensation of a needle piercing torn flesh without anything to numb the pain. Blood would be roughly wiped away with unsterile cloths, and herbal poultices might be applied, some with mild antiseptic properties, others utterly useless or even harmful. The risk of infection was immense. Every open wound was a gateway for deadly bacteria, leading to pus, fever, and potentially fatal sepsis. Many gladiators who survived the arena succumbed days or weeks later to infections that would be easily treatable today. Broken bones were set with rough splints made of wood or bark. Often without precise alignment, the healing process would be slow, agonizing, and often result in permanent deformities or limited mobility. Imagine a leg healing crookedly, leaving you with a permanent limp, or an arm that could no longer fully extend. These lasting physical impairments would make future combat even more challenging and painful. One particularly grim aspect of gladiatorial medicine was the widespread use of brand marks. Gladiators were often branded with symbols, usually on their face or limbs, with hot irons. This wasn't just for identification. It was a permanent mark of their enslaved status and served as a reminder of their infamia, dishonor. Imagine the searing pain of the hot iron, the smell of burning flesh, and the permanent disfigurement. This brutal practice highlighted that, even when you were cared for, it was always within the context of your dehumanized status. It really sucked to be branded like cattle. The gladiators' diet, as discussed, also played a role in their post-injury recovery. The high-carb, high-calcium diet, the bone ash drink, was specifically designed to promote bone density and fat insulation, which theoretically might aid in healing by providing raw materials for bone repair and buffering against deeper cuts. However, this didn't negate the pain or the risk of infection. It was a strategy for resilience, not a cure for trauma. One fascinating and often overlooked detail is the existence of specialized gladiatorial doctors, medici gladiatorum. These individuals were highly valued for their ability to patch up and preserve valuable gladiators. Galen, the renowned Roman physician, gained much of his early experience and knowledge working as a doctor for a gladiatorial school in Pergamon. His writings detail practical approaches to treating wounds, setting bones, and even performing rudimentary surgeries, offering a rare glimpse into the practical realities of ancient trauma medicine. Historians still meticulously study Galen's medical texts to understand the specific treatments applied to gladiators, and how his experience with these warriors shaped his later, broader medical theories. However, even with skilled medici, the fundamental limitations of ancient medicine meant that many severe injuries were simply untreatable. Internal bleeding, head trauma, and systemic infections often meant a slow, agonizing death. Even if you were dragged alive from the arena, the medical care was designed to be functional, to keep you performing, not necessarily to grant you a long and comfortable life. So, your experience of medicine as a gladiator was a brutal extension of your combat. Wounds were dressed with crude methods, pain was endured, and the risk of infection was ever present. The treatments, while sometimes effective in a basic sense, were horrifyingly uncomfortable, often left you permanently scarred, and reinforced your status as a valuable, yet disposable, asset. This was a brutal reality where healing was a practical necessity for your owner, not a compassionate act for you. Even as your battered body was patched up and sent back into the ludus for more brutal training, a curious and dangerously seductive phenomenon would begin to emerge: fame and status for a gladiator. This wasn't true glory or lasting freedom. It was a fragile, exploitative illusion, making your life profoundly brutal in its ultimate hollowness. Imagine your first victory in the arena, the roar of the crowd, the sea of faces, the thrill of survival. If you fought well, with skill and courage, you might hear the shouts of your name, the applause, even see flowers or coins thrown onto the sand. For a man who was once a slave or a condemned criminal, this taste of public adoration, however fleeting, could be intoxicating. You were no longer just property, you were a spectacle, a celebrity, a temporary hero to the Roman masses. It truly sucked to be loved for your suffering. This popularity could translate into certain privileges within the ludus. A victorious gladiator might receive better food, a slightly less cramped cell, or perhaps even a concubine for a night. Your lanista would certainly see you as a valuable investment, ensuring you receive the best available medical care, however crude, to keep you fighting. You might even earn money, a small portion of the prize money from a victory, which you could use to buy small comforts or perhaps, with immense luck, save for your eventual freedom. Your image might even appear on mosaics, lamps, or graffiti, immortalizing your fighting style or a specific victory. People would wager on your fights, discuss your technique, and cheer your name. Women, both commoners and sometimes even noble women, might become infatuated with famous gladiators, sending them gifts or even seeking out illicit encounters. The paradoxical allure of the strong, dangerous, yet ultimately enslaved warrior was a potent fantasy for many Romans. However, this fame was a thin veneer over a brutal reality. You were still a slave, still owned by your lanista. Your status was entirely dependent on your ability to perform, to entertain, and to survive. One bad fight, one devastating loss, and your celebrity could vanish as quickly as it appeared, replaced by public indifference or even scorn. The cheers of the crowd were fickle, their adoration conditional on your continued spectacle. It really sucked to be a disposable celebrity. The popularity also created immense pressure. Every time you stepped into the arena, the expectations would be higher. You had to live up to your reputation, to put on a better show, to fight with even greater ferocity. The consequences of failure were not just defeat, but the loss of your life, or at least your reputation, which was crucial for avoiding a death sentence. This relentless pressure to perform under the constant threat of death would be a profound psychological burden. One unique detail, often highlighted by historians, is that some gladiators were highly educated and even philosophical, despite their brutal profession. Some managed to maintain a degree of intellectual life, engaging in philosophical discussions or even writing. This provides a fascinating contrast to their violent public persona, suggesting an inner world that sought meaning beyond the blood-soaked sand. Historians still debate the extent of literacy and philosophical engagement among different gladiator types, as direct evidence is rare, often inferred from epitaphs and literary references. Furthermore, this celebrity often came with the grim knowledge that your most ardent fans were also the ones demanding your death. The roar of the crowd that chanted your name was the same roar that would condemn you to the sword if you fell. Their admiration was for the spectacle of your suffering, not for your inherent worth as a human being. This exploitative nature of your fame was perhaps the most brutal truth of all. So, while the fleeting taste of fame and status might have offered a momentary reprieve from the relentless brutality of your life, it was ultimately a dangerous illusion. Your celebrity was bought with your freedom and maintained with your blood, making it a profoundly brutal and ultimately hollow experience. You were a celebrated slave, admired for your ability to kill and suffer, but never truly free from the chains that bound you to the arena. Even if you, the famous gladiator, captivated the roaring crowds and earned fleeting privileges, your life remained an inescapable paradox. You were a prisoner of fame, still utterly devoid of true personal freedom. The admiration of the Roman masses was a gilded cage, making your existence profoundly brutal in its ultimate lack of self-determination. Imagine a celebrated gladiator, a crowd favorite. You're given better food, perhaps a private cell, and access to rudimentary medical care. You might even have women throwing themselves at your feet, seduced by your danger and strength. But beneath the fleeting adoration and the minimal comforts, you were still property. You belonged to your lanista, the owner of the ludus. He had invested in you, trained you, and he controlled every aspect of your life. It truly sucked to be a rock star who couldn't leave the building. Your movements were severely restricted. You lived within the high walls of the gladiatorial school, guarded day and night. You couldn't visit the city, see your family if you had any remaining outside the ludus, or even choose your own companions. Every outing was supervised, usually a heavily guarded procession to the arena for training or combat. The roar of the crowd might be for you, but you were still marching to your designated cage. Even if you earned money from your victories, it wasn't truly yours. Any prize money would likely be held by your lanista, who would deduct expenses for your training, food, and upkeep, while some gladiators could eventually save enough to buy their freedom manumission. This was an incredibly rare feat, requiring years of victories and immense self-discipline, along with a benevolent or financially motivated lanista. Most gladiators died long before accumulating such wealth. The idea of financial freedom was a cruel joke. Your relationships, even with the women who admired you, were transactional and precarious. Any dalliance with a gladiator, a man of infamia, dishonor, was scandalous for a Roman citizen woman and could lead to severe repercussions for her. For you, it might offer temporary comfort, but it carried no promise of a lasting bond, family, or genuine partnership. You were an object of desire, not a person capable of forming truly free relationships. It really sucked to be desired, but not truly loved. The constant need to maintain your peak physical condition also robbed you of freedom. Your diet was controlled, your training relentless. There were no leisurely days off, no spontaneous outings. Your body was a weapon, and it had to be kept sharp. Regardless of your personal desires, every aspect of your life was geared towards the next fight, ensuring you were always ready to perform for the crowd. One common historical misconception is that all gladiators were treated as heroes, while some were famous. Their legal and social status as infamed, disgraced persons meant they were at the lowest rung of Roman society, grouped with actors, prostitutes, and condemned criminals. This social stigma, despite any popular adoration, meant they could never truly integrate into respectable Roman society, even if freed. Their fame was intrinsically tied to their dishonorable profession, ensuring they remained outcasts. Historians meticulously analyze the legal codes and social commentary of the Roman Empire to understand the complex and contradictory status of gladiators, confirming their unique blend of celebrity and social degradation. Furthermore, the very act of fighting for public entertainment meant you were constantly performing. Your life was a public spectacle, and every injury, every moment of fear, every act of courage was consumed by a bloodthirsty audience. There was no privacy, no space for authentic self-expression beyond the role you played in the arena. You lived your life under the relentless gaze of thousands, constantly aware that your every move was being judged and celebrated for its capacity to entertain. So, your life as a gladiator, even when graced with fame, was a profound and constant, brutal confinement. You were celebrated, admired, and perhaps even wealthy, but you remained a slave, stripped of personal autonomy, enduring relentless training, and perpetually living for the next performance. The roar of the crowd might sound like freedom, but it was merely the sound of your gilded cage, locking you into a life of spectacular servitude, even for those who miraculously survived the brutal arena and earned a degree of fame. The ultimate reality of being a gladiator was a tragic, predetermined end. Forget happily ever after, or a peaceful retirement. Your life, from the moment you entered the ludus, was a countdown to a likely violent and certainly unglamorous demise. This lack of a hopeful future made your existence profoundly brutal. Imagine a gladiator, perhaps a champion, having survived dozens of fights. The crowd still cheer your name, but your body is a roadmap of scars. Old wounds pull at your skin. Bones ache with chronic pain, and your movements are stiff with past injuries. Your famous face is a canvas of cuts and bruises, forever marked by the arena. Even if you escaped death by a direct sword thrust, the cumulative trauma was relentlessly breaking you down. It truly sucked to watch your body slowly fall apart. The most common end for a gladiator, even a successful one. Was death in the arena? While some fights ended in missio mercy, the crowd's thirst for blood was insatiable. And ultimately, your lanista controlled your fate. One misstep, one moment of weakness, or simply a particularly bloodthirsty editor could seal your doom, even if you were a skilled fighter. The constant exposure to deadly weapons and formidable opponents meant that sooner or later, your luck would run out. Every fight was another roll of the dice, with the odds stacked against you. For those who did survive a long career and perhaps even managed to buy their freedom manumissio, their retirement was far from idyllic. You might become a gladiatorial trainer doctor in a ludus, passing on your brutal skills to the next generation of doomed fighters. This would mean living out your days in the same grim environment that had shaped your life, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the suffering you once endured, your body, broken by years of combat, would have now oversee the breaking of others, a grim perpetuation of the cycle. It really sucked to train to the next victims. Alternatively, a freed gladiator might become a bodyguard for a wealthy patron, leveraging their fighting skills for protection. This offered some security, but still meant a life of service, perpetually tied to another's power. Some might try to open small businesses, perhaps taverns, but their infamia, social disgrace would often limit their integration into respectable Roman society. Your past, the bloody sand of the arena, would forever define you, preventing a truly normal existence. The concept of growing old peacefully, surrounded by family, was largely denied to you. Most gladiators, being slaves, were unlikely to have legal marriages or legitimate children who could inherit any wealth or provide support in old age. Even if a gladiator formed a bond with a woman, it was often a precarious, informal arrangement. Your family was the ludus, and your legacy was the cheers of a fickle crowd, not a lineage. One particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the gladiators' epitaphs. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed gravestones for gladiators, often commissioned by their lanistae or comrades. These epitaphs sometimes list their victories, their fighting styles, and their age at death, often tragically young. They are stark, concise memorials to lives that, despite moments of public glory, were brutally short and violent. For instance, a gladiator named Flamma, a Syrian, fought 34 times in 121, but eventually died at 30. His epitaph simply states he was a retiarius. These gravestones provide a chilling, personal glimpse into the grim reality behind the spectacle. Historians meticulously study these epitaphs to gain insights into gladiator origins, fighting records, and mortality rates, often finding them to be the most direct evidence of a gladiator's individual life. Furthermore, the psychological scars of a gladiator's life would linger. Even in retirement, the constant exposure to violence, the terror of facing death repeatedly, and the dehumanizing nature of their profession would leave them traumatized, perhaps suffering from what we now call PTSD. This mental anguish, combined with chronic physical pain, would make true peace a distant dream. So, your life as a gladiator, from its violent inception to its almost certain violent conclusion, was a tragic, predetermined path. Fame and fortune were fleeting illusions, offering momentary relief, but never true freedom or a peaceful future. The brutal reality was that your existence was a cycle of training, combat, and pain, culminating in a death that was either swift in the arena or a slow, agonizing decline outside it, ensuring that your legacy was forever stained with blood and suffering. You've endured the horrifying journey through the brutal reality of being a gladiator in the Roman Empire. As the echoes of the Colosseum's roar fade and the imagined scent of sand and blood finally dissipates, a chilling, profound truth settles upon you. The romanticized image of the gladiator is a cruel deception, masking a life defined by desperate circumstances, agonizing training, constant violence, and an almost certain undignified end. Consider the fundamental loss of freedom. From the moment you were captured, condemned, or sold yourself out of desperation, your life ceased to be your own. You became property, a commodity, owned by a lanista who held absolute power over your existence. Your very body was no longer yours. It was an instrument for public entertainment, destined for the sands of the arena. This utter lack of autonomy was the bedrock of your misery, a constant reminder that you were a slave. Regardless of any fleeting fame, then there's the relentless, dehumanizing training. The ludus was a brutal prison academy, designed to break your spirit and rebuild you into a fighting machine. Every day was a cycle of physical exhaustion, pain, and fear of the whip. Your diet, while calorically dense, was monotonous and designed not for your well-being, but to create a protective layer of fat for more spectacular wounds. This constant physical and psychological torment was a pervasive, inescapable part of your existence. And what about the constant threat of grievous injury and death every time you stepped into the arena? You knew it could be your last. Swords, tridents, and daggers tore flesh and shattered bone. The bloodthirsty crowd demanded a spectacle, and your body was the raw material for their entertainment. Even if you survived a fight, the wounds you sustained, often crudely treated in an unsanitary infirmary, would leave you with chronic pain, disfigurement, and a high risk of deadly infection. Your life was a series of gambles, with your own existence as the ante. Finally, the hollowness of fame and the inevitability of a grim end. While some gladiators achieved celebrity, it was a superficial, exploitative form of adoration. You were admired for your capacity to kill and suffer, not for your inherent human worth. This fame was fleeting, and your status as infames meant you could never truly integrate into respectable Roman society. Even if you gained your freedom, most gladiators died young, either in the arena or shortly after from their injuries, leaving behind a legacy of blood and a tragic lack of personal peace or familial continuation, one particularly poignant and often overlooked detail is the gladiator's oath. When you became a gladiator, you swore the octoramentum, an oath to endure, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. This chilling pledge encapsulated the entirety of your miserable life, a complete surrender of your bodily autonomy and your very life to the will of your owner and the demands of the Roman spectacle. It was a formal acceptance of your brutal fate, a powerful symbol of the dehumanization inherent in the profession. Historians still meticulously analyze the implications of this oath, debating the precise legal and moral weight it carried for the gladiators themselves. Ultimately, the story of being a gladiator in the Roman Empire is a stark reminder of the brutality of human entertainment and the extreme forms of subjugation that existed in the ancient world. It was a life lived at the intersection of desperation and spectacle, where courage was exploited, suffering celebrated, and glory was nothing more than a fleeting, bloody illusion. Your journey through this brutal reality exposes the true, brutal cost of Roman entertainment as you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep. Let the roar of the Colosseum fade into the distant past. You are safe, warm, and free, far removed from the blood-soaked sands and the agonizing reality of a gladiator's life. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of self-determination and human dignity. A stark contrast to the brutal truth we've explored tonight. You've completed your stark journey through the brutal reality of being a gladiator in the Roman Empire. And as the phantom taste of arena dust and the echoes of the crowd's bloodthirsty roar finally dissipate, a chilling, profound truth remains. The life of a gladiator was not one of celebrated heroism in the modern sense. It was a desperate, agonizing existence, a testament to the extremes of human exploitation and the chilling demands of ancient entertainment. Think about the fundamental dehumanization at its core. From the moment you were forced into the ludus, you ceased to be a person and became property, a tool for spectacle. Your body, your skills, your very life were owned by another, to be risked and sacrificed for the amusement of a fickle mob. This complete lack of autonomy, this reduction to a mere commodity, was the pervasive misery that underpinned every other hardship. Then consider the unrelenting cycle of pain and fear. Your training was designed to break you down and rebuild you, leaving your body a roadmap of chronic aches and permanent damage. Every step into the arena was a gamble with your life, facing opponents whose sole purpose was to kill or maim you. The wounds were gruesome, the medical care rudimentary, and the constant threat of a brutal. Public death was your ever-present companion, even if you survived. The physical and psychological scars would haunt you, a grim testament to the violence you endured and inflicted. And perhaps most tragically, the hollow promise of fame and freedom. While some gladiators achieved fleeting celebrity, it was a superficial adoration rooted in your capacity to suffer and bleed, not your inherent worth. Your social status as infamies meant true integration into respectable society was impossible. Even if you gained manumitio, your retirement often meant becoming a trainer in the very schools that had imprisoned you, or living a life perpetually marked by your violent past. Far from the peace and family longed for by ordinary men, ultimately, the story of the Roman gladiator is a brutal counter-narrative to popular myths. It reveals a world where courage was exploited, suffering was celebrated, and glory was a temporary, bloody illusion. Their lives were a profound human cost, paid in blood and agony for an empire's insatiable appetite for spectacle. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the sounds of the Colosseum's roar and the imagined scent of ancient blood fade into the quiet background of history. You're safe, warm, and free, incredibly far removed from the agonizing reality of a gladiator's life. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of dignity and self-determination, a stark contrast to the brutal truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night, and have sweet dreams.